I'm Mohammed Faruque, an associate professor of non-Western philosophy and environmental studies at the University of Cincinnati. And my research is actually quite multifaceted. So it seeks to foster a vital cross-cultural dialogue between Western and Islamic philosophies, which are often perceived by irreconcilable differences. And philosophers sometimes tend to have kind of ethnocentric narratives about some of these philosophies. So my philosophical work seeks to nurture a methodology, a cross-cultural methodology, and what some people call cosmopolitanism, like the philosopher Anthony Appiah, to kind of bring together these different wisdom traditions and create a kind of mutual overlapping fields of dialogue and explore shared humanity and human heritage. My first book was on selfhood. It's entitled Sculpting the Self. It explores what it means to be human in the post-Enlightenment world by looking at different theories from Western and Islamic philosophies, but also modern science and neuroscience especially. And of course, self is such an important topic in anthropology. So I do deal with a lot of theorists who have a lot of influence in anthropology. So this is a difficult question to answer because there's so many. But if I were to pick just one, I would pick McDowell's Mind and World, which when I was reading, I was quite struck by some of the insights it generated. So as you probably know, I mean, it's a kind of must-read book. So it kind of it adopts the Kantian intuition about the relationship between sensibility and understanding, and then kind of tries to chart a middle course between, on the one hand, coherentism, which tries to kind of talk about knowledge, but really when it comes to its empirical grounding, it has a lot of problems. And then on the other hand, you have the so-called myth of the given, which again, takes experience for granted. So McDill seeks to chart a kind of middle ground, and in the end, by adopting the Kantian insight, he's kind of able to build a kind of happy marriage between sensibility and understanding. But it also has a lot of critique of Kant's theory of the self, especially which he calls a thin as opposed to a thick theory of the self, because Kant's, when it comes to the famous unity of perception, there are a lot of issues. So I was quite inspired by that book, and I engaged with it at length, and also other modern philosophers, Wittgenstein and others, Evans, for example, in my book. But I also try to go further, and also talk, because the book itself was about the self. I talk about a more capacious approach to the self. But what I liked about McDowell's approach is his willingness to go beyond the kind of analytic and continental divide. Because when you read some treatises by analytic philosophers, they're within the gambit of analytic philosophy, and one often feels like much more can be said. So in the second part of Mind and World, he engages with Heidegger to some extent, Gadamer, when he talks about the second nature, what it means to be human and all that. Although I don't agree with a lot of the things he says there, but the approach itself is very close to what I try to do, which is bringing together different philosophical traditions. The work that I do, I think by definition, they have kind of broader implications. So the work on the self, what it means to be human, even non-philosophical folks think about their place in the world, like their personhood at one point or another. And then I also research climate change and environmental philosophy, and then AI. So all of these have kind of broader societal implications. So my approach is to kind of build on the insights of Islamic and Western philosophy, and then kind of use those insights to engage with concrete societal and kind of global problems like AI, like environmental philosophy. The statistics at least tells us that philosophy students always end up in getting a good job. And the fact that philosophy students are especially good when it comes to analytic thinking, so there's a wide range of careers available to them beyond just academic philosophy or philosophy, which is of course a viable option. our department is especially strong when it comes to offering strong and collaborative environment for students interested in multiple fields of inquiry, such as epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy. Again, such a difficult question to answer because there are so many good courses. But I remember I particularly enjoyed my course on ancient philosophy and the course on Aristotle and Plato. So I can talk more about the influences that especially Plato had on my own philosophical upbringing. But yeah, it was ancient philosophy and then Islamic philosophy. I think about it quite often. If I were to come to the earth, again, what would I do? So for me, if I were to come even 100 times, 99 times it would be philosophy. And I'll tell you why that is the case. And then the second choice would be perhaps a musician and a kung fu master or something. But yeah, I'm deeply into philosophy. And that's because philosophy is not just an academic discipline for me, it's a way of life. Yeah. Yeah, so this is a question I love to answer. So although I am influenced by different philosophical traditions and different philosophers from both the West and the East, but among them, Plato has had a special influence on me. And although in modern contexts, unfortunately, when we think of Plato, people think of him as a kind of idealist philosopher or someone who is talking about the world of forms and maybe a kind of static picture that he's giving us. And there are all those criticisms by modern philosophers such as Quine, whom I respect when it comes to analytic philosophy and talking about things like what is an object. But some of his remarks, which have been influential perhaps about Plato and ancient philosophy, are not very grounded in the text or the tradition itself. So as we overcome that kind of stereotypical image about Plato and realize that what Plato is asking us to do is not just giving solutions to so-called philosophical problems. He fundamentally wants us to think for ourselves and think creatively. And I guess that lies at the heart of doing philosophy. If we are satisfied with given answers, either if they come from religion or, as Whitehead said, science often for many people replaces religion today. If we think that we already know the answers to big metaphysical, cosmological, ethical questions because other philosophers, and now is the time to kind of talk about more specific, particular problems. That's not the way I think of philosophy. I think it's an open-ended field. You always have to kind of question and be open and do philosophy in a way that leaves different possibilities of engagement. And that's what I learned from Plato. I'm less interested in what he says about forms or the mind. Not that I don't kind of value them. I do. There are even mathematicians like Roger Penrose, who is a Platonist. Gödel was a Platonist, and so many other mathematicians. The set theory itself comes from Platonism. So Plato is especially important, but beyond the kind of more theoretical orientation. So the Greek talks about technetobio, the art of living. Philosophy was not simply a matter of kind of academic expertise and solving problems, but also a way of life. And you see it concretely in the way Plato is talking about different fields within philosophy, such as metaphysics, epistemology, and logic, and ethics, and so showing the interrelationship. Same with Aristotle and Stoicism and others, and there have been so many books. Pierre Hadot is one among many other people who have, he was one of the very first. Even Foucault has books about this. So yeah, philosophy guides my actions, my day-to-day actions, and I always think about what can philosophy teach me even when it comes to mundane actions. So yeah, favorite philosopher Plato, and that's what I learned from Plato, a particular way of being in the world, knowing the world, and orienting yourself to the world. So as you can imagine, given what I said, there's nothing outside of philosophy. Because when you say philosophy is a way of life for you, then everything that you do fits within that kind of scheme. I noticed sometimes some of our colleagues talk about things like, well, I'm not doing philosophy, meaning some kind of armchair thinking. Perhaps I go hiking, or I'm kind of watching films, experimenting with cooking and whatever. But for me, the very idea of living your life fully itself comes from philosophy. So I have some things that I do which are not quote unquote philosophical, like I'm deeply into music. I love listening to classical music, especially both Western and Persian and Indian. It's a vast field. But just to get the maximum aesthetic pleasure itself for me comes from my immersion in philosophy. So there's nothing outside philosophy, because philosophy does not have to be always reflective thinking, but it's about orientation. So I'm interested in cooking. I'm deeply interested in also plants, but I would not categorize them as a non-philosophical activity. just that's perhaps perhaps it's the difference. Yeah, so I'm one of those people who are born with what I call an existential impulse. So it just happens to some people naturally. So I remember when I was 12 or 13, one day it just occurred to me the question, who am I? And ever since I became so deep interested in philosophy, but I thought I would still have a economics related and finance related career, eventually leading to politics. But when I was doing my undergrad, I just realized that philosophy is so deep. When I was reading Nietzsche, Hume, and Heidegger, and all of these people, I realized that you can't just have philosophy as a part-time activity. And also, it led to a kind of deep spiritual and existential crisis. And so I finished my degree. I did quite well. But I just felt like the approach in economics was not sufficient to answer the metaphysical questions of what is real, for example, what is possible, what is good, those questions. And I just felt like you need to completely immerse yourself. And I feel so happy because this was when I was 19 or 20, now I'm about 36. And I made that decision because sometimes some people need this kind of approach to life. It's not those other things which might work for like common things like wealth, money, or whatever, prestige. But for me, knowledge and knowing about your place in the world, being in the world in a certain way, was of utmost importance. And I'm someone, I say jokingly, a convert to philosophy.